Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC knowledge. That's a new departure for us. Try it out. Twitter.com/UNC knowledge. Christopher Hitchens is a journalist and author. His most recent book is entitled God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. During at least part of his life, a subject to which we will return, Christopher referred to himself as a Trotskyist, correct?
Luxemburgist, Trotskyist, yes.
All right.
Post-Trotskyist, yeah.
Well, we'll give you time to elaborate. Yeah. Robert Service is a historian who has published major biographies of Lenin and Stalin, and whose most recent book, Comrades, represents the definitive study of communism as a worldwide movement. Robert Service's next book, to be published in November 2009, Trotsky. Very simply and briefly, was Leon Trotsky a good guy or a bad guy? Bob?
I don't think he was a good thing. I mean, he had a lot of good things about him as a person, but he wasn't a good thing for anybody at any time.
Christopher?
He's one of the very few people of the communist movement about whom it would be worth asking that question.
All right. Segment 1, Trotsky and Revolution. Leon Trotsky, born in Russia in 1879, second only to Lenin, Trotsky leads the Russian Revolution in October 1917. On Lenin's death, Trotsky finds himself outmaneuvered by Stalin. In exile, Trotsky writes his autobiography, and an attack on Stalin called the Revolution Betrayed. In Mexico City in 1940, Trotsky is assassinated by an agent of Stalin's secret police. Let's begin at the beginning. Trotsky is born to a farming family in Russia, in what is today in southern Ukraine. How do you go from a farm family to effectively second in command in the revolution of 1917?
He comes from a farmer's family where there's a huge impetus towards education. His father is pretty uneducated, but like a lot of Jewish colonists down in that part of the world,
the Pale of Settlement.
The Pale of Settlement in what is now Ukraine. He wanted to get his children educated, and he sends them off to Christian schools. Actually, Trotsky didn't have a university-level education, but he had a very thorough Lutheran church education in science, in languages, and all the rest of it. So if you want to get on and join the professions, that's quite difficult for a Jew in the Russian Empire of those days. But you could also become a revolutionary, and that way you could rise very quickly to the top.
So I think, let me over to you. What I hear here...
Good career move.
Yes, it's exactly that you're suggesting you became a revolutionary as a career move, Christopher.
And you're leaving out, or we're in danger of leaving out, or leapfrogging to 1917 and omitting 1905, which I think is his baptism, his crucible as a revolutionary, where he became a tremendous speaker in whatever you want to call it, Petrograd, Petersburg, where the idea of the Soviet as the parliament was, alternative Duma was first put forward. Where the revolutionaries conducted themselves as if they were speaking for a democratic majority rather than a factional minority. And where they impressed everyone by their demeanor at trial before they were sent off to Siberia. The great missed opportunity for Russia is 1905.
Yes.
Because if that doesn't work, then it's another decade of Tsarism and then a terrifying war, which is the wreckage of the whole country.
You've just, what is this, 600 and some pages, I think, Bob?
Yeah, it's far too big.
But it's the point, if I had your books here on Lenin and Stalin, this is about, you are treating Leon Trotsky as a figure of major importance in the 20th century. Why? Give me a sentence or two to help a layman understand why this figure matters to you.
He's one of the half-dozen outstanding Marxist revolutionaries. He helps to make the October Revolution that brings the communists to power in 1917. He's a leader of the Red Army that fights the Civil War, and he's the intellectual architect of a lot of aspects of communism that get laid down in the 20s and actually still have an impact through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Which now leads me to ask you why you called yourself a Trotskyist. There's something in this man you admire, something in his writings to which you adhere?
Yes, the struggle of the left opposition against Stalin in the 1920s led to a sort of emulating movement, an anti-Stalinist Marxist left in the rest of Europe and Asia, in fact everywhere, America, Latin America, usually rather small, but often quite intellectually influential. The thing about Trotsky, to echo something Professor Service was saying, is that he combined in himself the role of man of action and man of ideas. He could write about literature, and did. He helped to write the Surrealist Manifesto with André Breton and people of that kidney. He could hold forth on an amazing number of subjects, but he was a soldier as well and a revolutionary, and a person of immense moral and physical courage. So you had a charismatic figure who, in addition, I'll just make one more point.
Yes.
Wrote pamphlets and made speeches against the menace of Hitlerism, which are much better and were made much earlier than any of Winston Churchill's. They are. Irving Howe describes them as the greatest political polemic ever written in the 19th century.
I just spotted something. We've got just about 1 minute left in this segment, but I think I spotted something. You just spoke about Leon Trotsky in roughly the same way I've heard you describe George Orwell. Same tones of admiration for much of the same reason.
George Orwell was
true?
Well, no. But I can see what you must be noticing. In fact,
man of actions,
George Orwell.
Man of the left, standing.
George Orwell joined a sort of Trotsky-ish or Trotsky sympathizing, not actually officially Trotskyist, but a militia that had a lot of Trotskyist influence in it in Spain to fight against both Stalin and Hitler.
All right. Segment 2, defeat and exile. On the death of Lenin in 1924, a succession struggle takes place among Stalin, Trotsky, and others. Trotsky does not do too well. By 1927, he's removed from the Central Committee. In 1928, he's sent into internal exile, and in 1929, he's expelled from the Soviet Union, to which he never returns. What is taking place during those 5 years between the death of Lenin and the expulsion from the Soviet Union of Trotsky?
There's a factional struggle, and the left opposition, as Christopher has been saying, posed the idea that the revolution was finished under its existing leadership of Stalin and others, and that compromises had been made with the revolutionary spirit of the October events of 1917.
And this is Trotsky's position. He's a purist. He wants to return.
Well, he says he is. He says he is. But actually, most of his ideas overlap considerably with those of Stalin. The amount of dancing on the end of a pin, a number of angels dancing on the end of a pin on this question are very considerable. And I think that it's a mistake to take Trotsky at his own face value, to take his words at their face value.
Robert Service, I quote you from your forthcoming biography, Trotsky. I became convinced that Trotsky's diagnoses of the causes of his defeat by Stalin was self-serving and misleading. Trotsky did not go down to defeat at the hands of the bureaucracy. He lost to a man with a superior understanding of Soviet public life. Explain that.
Stalin understood how the system worked. They were all bureaucrats. Trotsky said he was criticizing bureaucrats, that it was a bureaucratic system, and he was on the outside of it, criticizing the bureaucrats. But when you don't have a free press, an autonomous judiciary, when there is no pluralist politics at all, then everyone's carrying out orders in an administrative political system. So his critique in the 1920s of Stalinism, as it was emerging, was a false critique. It was based on lack of self-knowledge.
Well, was it a false critique, or was it a critique that was true but to which he himself failed to live up? To end with a proposition. Good grief, that's a mess. But in other words, is there something in what he says, even if there's a bit of hypocrisy or more than a bit in his saying?
Well, he's rehearsing for what he does later call Revolution Betrayed, and I think the great area where
his book against Stalin, which he writes in exile.
And he says that the great point where he thinks the revolution is being betrayed is in the essentially Stalinist concept and bureaucratic concept of socialism in one country. Trotsky felt the revolution had to keep going in order to survive and needed to ignite counterpart or brother or sister revolutions in two countries in particular, Germany and China. And Stalin was not in favor of revolution internationalist policy in either place.
Now, I would totally disagree with you. I think the evidence is really strong that all the communist leadership, the entire communist leadership in the 1920s, knew that the October Revolution in Russia would not survive unless it could expand. It couldn't survive in an isolated state. The only difference, serious difference between Trotsky and Stalin was what were the chances of a successful German revolution. So that, for example, in the attempt...
And Trotsky rated them as higher.
Trotsky rated them as
Stalin
higher.
Lord, do I hate using this term of him, but he's a conservative figure in a certain sense. He wants to consolidate.
Figure.
He wants to consolidate the gains within Russia first. Fair?
Yeah, well, yes, and conservative, to the point of, yes, reactionary.
They all wanted to expand the revolution. Internationalism wasn't just an ideological imperative, it was a practical one, because if Russia stayed isolated, it would always be vulnerable to a crusade against it by Germany or Britain or France or the USA.
Right. Richard Pipes, Christopher, in his History of the Russian Revolution, quote, "In theory, one can conceive of Trotsky grasping the torch from the dying Lenin. What one cannot conceive is how he could have been in a position to do so. Lenin ensured that the man who controlled the Central Party apparatus controlled the state, and that man was Stalin," close quote. So it's not Stalin destroying the beautiful prospect by wresting control of the revolution from Trotsky. It's the very founder of the Soviet state ensuring that Stalin will succeed him.
Even though at the last, Lenin realized he made a mistake, and
But by then he'd had
Stalin
strokes,
was a very crude and ruthless machine man.
By the way, do we know that is that established that Lenin effectively attempted to change his mind?
Yes.
But he was
Yes.
it is established.
There's a reasonably
established,
good, what I think you'll agree, it's a good book, Professor Moshe Lewin's book, it's called Lenin's Last Struggle, about the realization, but it doesn't negate what Pipes says about Stalin being made inevitable by Lenin to that extent. Isaac Deutscher makes a wonderful, ironic comment about this.
Isaac Deutscher writes the 3-volume biography of Trotsky in the 60s, 50s?
All
right.
50s, 60s. They're called, in seriatim, the prophet armed, the prophet unarmed, the prophet outcast. The Bolsheviks made a huge study, all Marxists did in those days, of the French Revolution. They wanted to know what had gone wrong with it, how it eventuated in Bonapartism, how could they prevent a Bonaparte from arising. They looked around their number. They were looking for someone flamboyant, ambitious, clever, with military genius, which obviously Trotsky is the one you have to fear Bonapartism from.
Because Stalin is the plotting
Whereas
figure.
Stalin, the boring, mediocre committee man who's always ready for another few hours of iron-bottomed attendance at the... They didn't think he had it in him to be a Bonaparte.
Right.
So if it's one of the most sad and in a way almost beautiful ironies of history. It's so tragic.
Segment 3, what if? Let me read you a question that we got from a Twitter subscriber. Here it is. And this is the question of questions. It's from a man, Eric Ford Holovinsky. Anyway, some say the USSR would have been better had Trotsky led instead of Stalin. How so? So let us cast aside segment 2, in which we just demonstrated that it would have been pretty hard for Trotsky, in fact, to have taken control, and just experiment here in our minds. If Trotsky is in charge instead of Lenin, how are things different, Christopher?
Instead of Lenin or instead of Stalin?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. If Trotsky takes charge instead of Stalin, sorry.
I think there would be less anti-Semitism. And I'm not just being tautologist, I think, because in general, less paranoia and less Russian, Georgian, if you like, chauvinism, backwardness and suspicion of the kind Stalin incarnated, that lead to things like not just purges, but show trials of a sort of fantastic inquisitional sort that are, almost pornographic.
Let me quote Bob.
I don't say there wouldn't have been some pretty warm work, and Trotsky's enemies would have been ruthlessly dealt with.
Let me quote Bob in
Trotsky.
Trotsky, I'm quoting you to yourself, Bob. If ever Trotsky had been the paramount leader instead of Stalin, the risks of a bloodbath in Europe would have been drastically increased.
Yeah.
How so?
Because he would have taken more risks in promoting the cause of revolution in Germany. They all agreed that there had to be a revolution in Germany, but Trotsky was prepared to take far more risks. The other thing so there would have been a bloodbath in Europe before Hitler.
Or perhaps
There would have
instead
been-
of.
Instead of Hitler, yeah. Instead of
I'm
Hitler.
not sure how much of a bloodbath that is if It preempts National Socialism.
But the other thing that would have happened had he succeeded Lenin in the mid-1920s the other thing that would have faced Trotsky was how would he have brought about the industrialization of the economy, which he said he was going to do, and how would he have pushed peasants into collective farms, which he also said he was going to do, without force. It's very, very unlikely that he wouldn't have taken the decision that actually some force would have been necessary. In other words, a sort of gentle Stalinism would have arisen under Trotsky's leadership. These two were blood brothers who hated each other. One a flamboyant, multilingual, world historical personality. The other
and an extremely good writer, by the way.
Extremely good writer,
good slinger of prose.
I mean,
right,
his autobiography is magical to read. Stalin, solid, stolid, plotting, careful, and also very steady. He didn't take off 4 months just to go and write a book on literature and revolution. But one way or another, the basic agenda of the two men was much more similar than it was dissimilar.
In fact, some of that doesn't even need to be speculative, because there was a point where Trotsky said that Labour should be, when he was fresh from running the army, he said the workers should be put in the army and put under orders. None of this sentimental dancing around about trade union rights and so forth. I mean, we need to basically make labor into conscription.
Let me just simply put before you several of the outrages of Stalin, and you tell me how they'd have been different, if at all, under Trotsky. The enforced famine in the Ukraine. Famine takes place, Stalin forces the kulaks, he sets up roadblocks so they can't escape from the famine, and effectively starves them out. Trotsky, what would have been different?
I don't think this would have been the same.
That would not have been the same.
There is something really, truly grotesque about what happened under Stalin, but something pretty grotesque would have happened under Trotsky, and it's only because we know how awful it was in the 1930s under Stalin that we tend to let Trotsky off the hook. That's my basic position. That
you grant that?
Well, you can't, only because we know the circumstances, the material circumstances were very grim.
Yes.
I mean, there was a great deal of scarcity and dislocation that anyone would have had to deal with. I mean, I think there would have been a famine in the Ukraine if Generals Denikin and Kolchak and Wrangel had won the Civil War and defeated Bolshevism altogether. So I'm a materialist before I'm a Marxist on that. But Stalin...
You don't think so?
There's good evidence that Stalin used the famine to destroy Ukrainians.
To starve out his enemies, yes.
Queer Ukrainians, in other words, as a racist.
Right.
But famine wasn't inevitable in the former Russian Empire. It was something that often happened. It was much more likely to happen with a centralized state-run economy where a few people at the center in Moscow take all of the big decisions. And if you've got a bungler like Stalin, it's more likely to happen than if you've got a somewhat more astute character such as Trotsky. But it was still a risk that you wouldn't be able to run an economy. It was an absolute certainty that you couldn't run that kind of economy and get the kind of results that you wanted for popular consumption, such as you can have under a market economy.
Of the purges, Christopher. Purges, I'm speaking very loosely here, by which simply to say, even within the communist, Khrushchev drew the distinction that Lenin never killed a fellow communist. Stalin hardly ever stopped, right? So the notion was that anyone who might be in a position to pose some sort of threat to him, Stalin eliminated. Trotsky would not have done that?
Not in that way, no, I don't think so. Yeah, of course you're right. I mean, Stalin killed more communists than Hitler did, quite a lot more. And Stalin was paranoid. He had a sort of primitive mind, open to conspiracy theory. He didn't enjoy faction fighting. Trotsky loved it. He enjoyed polemics. He carried it on with people close to him all his life. Sometimes he's a bit thuggish in his prose, I've got to say. But you don't get the feeling that he secretly just wants to torture and kill anyone who gets in his way.
All right. Segment 4, Trotsky's, I'm borrowing a phrase from your essay on the Ivan Deutscher biography, Trotsky's moral moments. Christopher Hitchens writes of the second half of the 1930s as a moral moment for Leon Trotsky. Quote, Christopher, Trotsky was perhaps the most prescient writer of his day in warning of the true menace of National Socialism. Give us a sentence or two of explanation. National Socialism, meaning, of course, the Nazis.
The rise to power in Germany of a sort of mechanized and highly modernized, but nonetheless sort of medievally cruel and superstitious movement based on a very primitive race theory of racial superiority. And Trotsky writes a marvelous polemic saying it's incredible to see how millions of Germans now use electrical lights
I'll quote
and drive
it to
on
you.
autobahns, but do you believe in the power of signs and magical symbols?
Trotsky, quote, "Today there lives alongside the 20th century the 10th or 13th. 100 million people use electricity and still believe in the magic power of signs and exorcism. Capitalist society is puking up the undigested barbarism. Such is the physiology of National Socialism." That's pretty good, isn't it?
That is good, but then if you take the whole of Trotsky in those years, and not just that prescient
Christopher does call it a moment, moral moment.
commentary on Nazism, yeah, he was right about Nazism, although he still thought of Hitler as a mere puppet of the what he called the big bourgeoisie in Germany, rather than an independent actor who could do even more damage than any kind of right-wing movement yet known.
Here's the bit.
Yes, but I should just add that Stalin's line, the so-called third period of the Comintern line, the German Communist Party's line, was that Hitler was just that and no more, and that he could be allowed to win. And it would be no worse, because next would come communism. Hitler would just be a door opener for Red Germany. And Trotsky, writing to the German working class, saying, if fascism comes to power, it will ride over your skulls and your spines like a terrific tank. It will be the end of civilization. You have to make common cause with the Social Democrats. Make a united front against this monstrosity.
So he understood.
It's Cassandra, Peter. It's like hearing Cassandra.
Christopher, but listen to this now. This business about 20th century, next to which lives the 10th or the 13th, people use electricity, still believe in the power of signs and exorcism. Couldn't almost every word of that have been said about the revolution in Russia, to which Trotsky devoted his life's energies? That this thing was in fact a kind of at least certainly that is the point that Pipes makes in his history of the Russian Revolution, and Bob touches on it again and again, that communism does not account for what took place in Stalin and indeed through to Gorbachev. You have to understand the Russian substructure of it all, that there's a kind of barbarousness which Marxism unleashes, right? So here's what I'm trying to say. We grant that he had a moral moment looking at the Germans and the rise of Hitler, but does that, it seems to me you're being a little too forgiving that he didn't have a few moral moments about his own country.
What Pipes overestimates, no, I suppose I mean underestimates, is the element of barbarism in Russia that has nothing to do with communism, but that is authentically Russian.
No, but that's exactly the point that Pipes is making.
Serfdom,
yes.
Tsarism, anti-Semitism, pogroms, the Black Hundreds, the Tsar being the head of the Orthodox Church.
That's precisely that is Pipes' point.
But there's another aspect of this moral moment, that at the same time as Trotsky pointed out the iniquities of Nazism, he thoroughly approved of the kind of revolutionary war that had been carried into Poland and hopefully, as he thought, into Germany in 1920. So when the moment comes for the Soviet Union to invade Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Eastern Poland,
he's all for it.
He's all for it. And he falls out with a lot of American Trotskyists over that very question. And when the Soviet Union invades Finland in the Winter War of 1939 to 40, the same thing. He's all for it. So his idea of foreign policy is not a sort of morally pure position at all. If you take the German case, it looks a bit that way. If you take the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Polish, Finnish case, it doesn't look that way at all.
That's true. Sorry.
Trotsky's I'm quoting you once again to yourself, Trotsky's most enduring and tenacious battle was against the monstrous regime that had resulted from his earlier exertions.
Yes.
Stalin. On the other hand, as Bob has just told us, it's not as if Trotsky wrote off the Russian Revolution once Stalin had complete control of it. He was still a partisan.
There's a great argument among Trotskyisant or Trotsky-ish academics, intellectuals, historians, and so on, as to what would have happened if he hadn't been killed in 1940. In that, having always thought that the workers' state, however deformed or degenerated, by Stalinism was an advance over its rivals, even if extended by bayonets. After the Hitler-Stalin Pact, direct collusion,
right.
There's evidence that in his papers and in his arguments and correspondence, he was moving to a position of saying that actually Stalinism was a new form of barbarism. And that the only responsibility one would have historically would be to take the side of its victims. These are the last things he's writing before Stalin has him killed. So yes, the logic of this seems to be accepted by the person who we're talking about.
Segment 5, Trotsky Today. Robert Service. When Trotsky was assassinated, the idea again went the rounds on the Western political left that the tragedy of Soviet history lay in Trotsky's failure to win the struggle to succeed Lenin. Close quote. That somehow that it was Stalin instead of Trotsky is the tragedy of Soviet history.
Yeah.
Does that retain some currency today, does it not?
It sure does, and I think it's totally wrong. It's a romantic view of Trotsky. Trotsky was in favor of a one-party state, of mass terror, of an end to political and cultural pluralism. He was a thorough, schematic thinker and practitioner of all of that. The idea that somehow a humane version of communism could have come out of Trotskyism is pure romanticism, but it appealed to people in the 60s and the 70s who wanted just such a figure, someone who was standing outside all of the worries about the Vietnam War and and wanted to think that there was a possibility that the USSR, if it had been differently led back in the 20s, then a different turn could have taken place.
Now, which leads me to your thinking, because as I read your writings over a quarter of a century now, you subscribe to this.
Can't ask for more than that.
You subscribe to this. You really did fall for Trotsky. You were part of the if only school, were you not? But now you're not.
Well,
so what's happened?
Less and less. But never.
Explain yourself, not Trotsky
no.
yourself.
Look, here's the thing. It's a matter of how many what ifs and if onlys one's allowed.
Very nicely put.
The American general who was sent to invade Russia after the First World War in Siberia. Remember how Ronald Reagan said that the US and the USSR have never had a fight? Yes, they had. The US was part of the foreign intervention after. I've forgotten his name. It was a Michigan detachment, though, because they were good fighters in the snow. He said that in the areas of Russia controlled by the whites, by Generals Kolchak and Denikin, he said he didn't know of anything in the annals of history that showed a regime that took human life at a lesser price than that.
Then the Tsarist, essentially
if Trotsky's Red Army had not won the Russian Civil War, then the word for fascism, we have to face the fact, was probably going to be a Russian word instead of an Italian word. So we were not replacing a parliamentary democracy with an independent judiciary here. Okay? These things were not, so to speak, on the historical agenda. Now, that doesn't mean that communist teleological propaganda is thereby vindicated, but we've got no right to say that we're all completely sure that it's a disaster that Trotsky wins and the whites don't.
Mm.
Yeah,
will you buy that? I think that's fair. Is it?
It's a little exaggerated, but it's pretty fair that the whites had officers who were vicious, carried out a brutal civil war against the Reds.
Brought the protocols of the elders of Stalin to Europe in their backpacks when they left, which not doing us any favours. Brings the germinal of fascism with it.
But I mean, if the whites had won the Civil War, that wouldn't have been the end of the matter. I think they'd have had a hard time consolidating a far-right regime, just as the communists had a hard time in the 1920s consolidating a far-left regime. What I'm trying to say is that the discussion among the communist leaders, the factional fighting, was over a fairly narrow terrain. And to disregard that and to put up Trotsky as a humanitarian communist
a lot of nonsense.
is basically a lot of nonsense.
That really would be romantic. But don't forget my earlier point about 1905 either. 1905, there aren't Bolshevik
and
Bolshevik.
That was the chance.
Yes.
That was the chance.
And it's called, what becomes the Bolshevik Party is called the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. And it's the Russian and international left that really hopes for a democratic and relatively peaceful victory over Tsarism, which, if it had been consummated, would have prevented the First World War in all likelihood.
Do you buy that?
Without the First World War, it's hard to imagine either Nazism or Stalinism taking the form that they did.
I think that if Russia had undergone a revolution in 1905, all sorts of forces would have been let loose, as they were in 1917, and
even if the liberals had managed to retain control of it, even if, who was it, Stolypin, the prime minister?
The big difference...
Or was that simply not fated to happen?
Well, it would have been difficult, but the big difference between 1905 and 1917 is the First World War. Mm-hmm. The brutalization and disruption of the First World War gave the communists their chance. They wouldn't have had the same chance, I agree with this, in 1905.
Christopher notes, Trotsky admits, as the Second World War is underway and his own life is drawing to a close, he doesn't know the ice pick is headed at his skull, but he knows he's in failing health, that the war might end without a socialist revolution. Quoting Trotsky, "We would be compelled to acknowledge," Trotsky wrote, "that Stalinism was rooted not in the backwardness of the country, but in the congenital incapacity of the proletariat to become a ruling class." In other words, we were wrong from the get-go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then it would be necessary to establish in retrospect that the present USSR was the precursor of a new and universal system of exploitation, which is the view of the president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev himself, in about 1989, 90, and 91, when the thing goes out of existence. Here's what I'm asking for a kind of moral and historical assessment.
Well, you may say he took a lot of persuading before he got
Yes, an awful lot of persuading, and even then I'm not aware of... is there a word of remorse that he utters?
I don't think so. I mean, he does actually entertain this thought, only to dismiss it. In the end, he dismisses it. But at least he had the thought that actually the October Revolution of 1917 was founded on a falsehood.
Tens of millions dead, and it occurs to Trotsky that it may have been, oops, just a mistake.
Yeah.
But he puts that out of... All right.
And he's demoralized and ill, and he's expecting to die. The better thing for Trotsky would have been to have died several years earlier and to have stayed a martyr and not to have written the sort of stuff he wrote in the 1930s that condemn him in his own words as a weak version of Stalinist. You reckon it would have been better for his reputation if he'd never written the Revolution Betrayed? That's the attack on Stalin. You throw that in as well. I mean, it would have been good if he'd written that too. But if he died somewhat earlier, if we didn't have the correspondence that he held with the American Trotskyists who said, how on earth can you support the USSR's invasion of Eastern Poland? What on earth do you think you're doing? Condoning what is essentially an alliance between the Third Reich and the USSR. What are you doing saying it's okay to invade Finland? And why on earth do you assert that Marxism-Leninism is a scientifically proven set of doctrines? Why are you getting so uptight about new ideas of philosophy and social science?
That stuff. You see, that's a difference.
You wouldn't be without...
I wish it had gone on a bit longer. I mean, it starts with a great discussion over Kronstadt, for which Trotsky was historically personally responsible.
Rebellion of the sailors.
The naval garrison off Petersburg.
1921.
Which was put down by brutal force, and for which Trotsky accepted, as military commander, general responsibility. And it was brought up against him by a faction. Actually, I think one of them quite well associated with Hoover, James P. Cannon, in various polemics in the late 1930s, which are, I think, an imperishable read. They show a polemical mind and some very good rival polemical minds engaging at a very high level. I wish he'd lived another few years and had to accept the whole logic, which I think he would have done. I'd also love to see what he would have said about Zionism and Jewish nationalism after the evidence of the Second War. Did he think of himself as Jewish? He thought of himself as very...
He did.
He thought of himself post-ethnically, but in terms of background, he was absolutely open about the fact that he was Jewish.
And very sensitive to anti-Semitism as a weapon of reaction. Right. But he thought of himself as a cosmopolitan.
Right. We need to wrap it up at last. Claire Luce used to say that history gives each man, no matter how large, only one sentence. Lincoln freed the slaves. What's the sentence that history gives to Leon Trotsky, Christopher?
Well, this is a sentence about him, if
Yes.
on your Lincoln analogy.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's very good. I'll have to, I'll brood about it.
Will you? All right. You take a pass.
I'd say it would be a double verdict. Such a waste of a talent. This was the most amazingly brilliant man, a writer, a thinker, an active politician, but such a dreadful mistake of a life and a career and an ideological and revolutionary commitment.
I will give you
George Steiner's book, George Steiner's essay on him is called Trotsky and the Tragic Imagination. And with me, it's the element of tragedy which you don't find if you're usually talking about the fall of someone who is power hungry.
Christopher Hitchens, Robert Service, author of the forthcoming Trotsky. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.